Cymbeline, Part 1. A Princess of Britain. Daughter of Cymbeline, King of Britain, and his acknowledged heir, Imogen, had fallen into deep disgrace at court, and incurred her father's severest displeasure. Cymbeline had lately married a second wife, a widow with one son, and it had occurred to both the king and queen that it would be an excellent plan for Imogen to marry this youth. But Cloten was a clownish, ill-conditioned lout, and Imogen had chosen to prefer as her husband a poor but worthy gentleman. Posthumus Leonidas had been her playfellow from childhood, for his parents dying when he was an infant. He had been adopted by Cymbeline, who brought him up almost as his own son. Though the king, queen, and Cloten himself were enraged at the choice Imogen had made, and the courtiers were forced to appear as if they followed the royal example, not one of the latter but was glad at heart at the thing he pretended to scowl at. For while Cloten was, as one gentleman expressed it, a thing too bad for bad report, Leonidas was a man endowed with such outward personal grace and such inward nobility of soul that it would be difficult to find his equal through all the world. Even as a boy, most praised, most loved, he had come unharmed through the trying ordeal of being a court favorite, drinking in all branches of learning as lightly as others do air, and the proof of his excellence was evident in the fact that so peerless a lady as Imogen had chosen him for her husband. But Cymbeline, untouched by his merits, was indignant that his daughter had married a beggar, when she might have had the only son of the queen. He pronounced the sentence of banishment on Leonidas, and commanded that Imogen should be imprisoned at court, under the custody of her stepmother. The new queen was a crafty, designing woman, whose chief aim at present was to secure the future throne for her boorish son. Cymbeline, it is true, had had 2 sons of his own, but they were both stolen when they were little more than babies, the eldest being only 3, and the youngest 2 years old. From the day of their disappearance, no trace of them had ever been found. The Princess Imogen was now the only child, and, as Cymbeline's heir, the queen was anxious to entice her into marriage with her son. When this attempt failed, the queen did not scruple to plan other and darker means to accomplish her purpose. She had some knowledge of medicine, and took pleasure in making perfumes and preserves from all sorts of herbs and simples. Under pretense of perfecting her knowledge, she begged from a physician, Cornelius, who had helped her with her studies, some most poisonous compounds, which would produce a languishing death. She said she did not intend to use them on human beings, but only on animals, to try their power, and apply the antidote, in order to discover their respective virtues and effects. The good physician did not at all approve of such cruel experiments. He knew the queen's evil nature. He would not trust one of such malice with drugs of so deadly a kind, while, therefore, pretending to comply with the queen's request, he really gave her some harmless compounds, which would only stupefy and dull the senses for a while, but do no ultimate injury. It was well that Cornelius acted so discreetly, for the queen lost no time in putting her wicked schemes into practice. When Leonidas, on his banishment, departed for Rome, he left behind him a most faithful, devoted servant called Pisanio, who was to watch over and attend his dear wife. The crafty queen tried to win over Pisanio to her interests, promising him large bribes if he would influence Imogen on behalf of her son. But Pisanio's steadfast fidelity was not to be shaken. Seeing that all her fawning friendliness was not likely to achieve her aim, the Queen tried another method to remove Leonidas from her path. While talking with Pisanio, she cunningly let fall, as if by accident, the little box of drugs which she had obtained from Cornelius. When Pisanio picked it up, and would have returned it to her, she insisted on his keeping it, as an earnest of future good which she intended to bestow on him, explaining that it was a wonderful cordial by which she had 5 times redeemed the king from death. The Queen hoped that Pisanio, wishing to do his master good, would give him some of this cordial, which would certainly prove fatal. After the death of Leonidas, if Imogen still persisted in refusing to marry Cloten, the Queen determined that she, too, should have a taste of the poison, when the way would be clear for Cloten to ascend the throne. While these things were happening in Britain, Leonidas had reached Rome. Here, at the house of a friend, Philario, he happened to meet some acquaintances that he had known in younger days, one a Frenchman, and another an Italian called Iachimo. The Frenchman reminded him of a quarrel which they had had on the occasion of their former meeting, which, he said, was of a slight and trivial nature. But Leonidas, with his ripened judgment, would not admit that the cause of the quarrel was altogether slight. "Can we, with manners, ask what was the difference?" inquired Iachimo. The Frenchman replied that a dispute had arisen as to which of the ladies, whom each loved in his own country, was to be most praised, and that Leonidas had asserted that his, in Britain, was the fairest, most virtuous, wise, and constant, and that her favour was less easily to be won than the rarest of the ladies in France. "That lady is not now living, or this gentleman's opinion is by this time worn out," laughed Iachimo. "She holds her virtue well, and I my mind," returned Leonidas. "You must not so far prefer her before our ladies of Italy," said Iachimo, still in the same jesting way. But Leonidas was in earnest, and in spite of the good-natured bantering of the others, he persisted in extolling the charms and excellence of Imogen. At their parting in Britain, Imogen had given her husband as a remembrance a diamond ring, which had been her mother's, and which she held very precious, and Leonidas, on his part, had clasped on her arm a bracelet. Iachimo now said laughingly that if only he had the chance of a few minutes' conversation with Imogen, he would soon win her affection. In fact, he was ready to wager the half of his estate against Leonidas's ring, that there was no lady in the world of whom he could not say the same. Leonidas began to get annoyed, and Philario begged them to let the subject drop, but Iachimo would not give in. He now said he wished he had wagered his whole estate. He would lay 10,000 ducats against Leonidas's ring, that if he went to the court of Britain, he would bring back evidence that Imogen's favour was by no means so hard to win as Leonidas imagined. Leonidas, stung by Iachimo's remarks, and longing to prove the falsity of his assertions, and to punish him for his impertinence, said he would accept the wager, but he would wager gold against Iachimo's gold. The ring he held as dear as his finger, it was part of it. Iachimo accused him of fearing to lose the wager, and said he was wise in declining to risk his ring, which so irritated Leonidas that he accepted the challenge. "I dare you to this match. Here's my ring," he exclaimed. "I will not have this wager," said Philario, but both Leonidas and Iachimo declared it should go on, and proceeded to settle the conditions, and to have them lawfully recorded. Only Leonidas further determined that, if Iachimo succeeded in winning his wager, owing to Imogen's fault or weakness, Leonidas would cast off his wife utterly. She was not worth debate. If, on the other hand, Iachimo's advances were repulsed with the contempt they deserved, Iachimo should answer with his sword for his impertinence. To this Iachimo agreed, and without delay he started for Britain. Arrived at the court of Cymbeline, he was introduced to Imogen as the bearer of letters from Leonidas. She received him with charming frankness and cordiality, delighted to welcome one of whom her husband wrote as bestowing much kindness on him. In accordance with the plan Iachimo had thought out, he replied in answer to Imogen's eager questions concerning Leonatus that he was quite well, exceedingly pleasant, and very merry and gamesome. In fact, he was called the Briton Reveller. Imogen was somewhat surprised and a little hurt to hear this, for at home Leonatus was, if anything, of a grave and melancholy disposition. "I never saw him sad," protested Iachimo, and further he added, "Leonatus always laughed loudly when one of his companions, a Frenchman, seemed sorrowful, because he left behind him in his own country a lady whom he loved." "Fancy a man sighing for the bondage of any woman," Leonatus had said. It pained Imogen to think that Leonatus cared so little about her, as Iachimo's words implied, but when this smooth-tongued Italian gentleman went on to pity her for the way in which her husband seemed to have forgotten her, and counselled her to take revenge, she began to be on her guard. "Revenge?" she said. "How should I be revenged? If this be true, how should I be revenged?" Iachimo replied that if Leonatus cared so little about her as to be able to amuse himself happily with all the most riotous companions in Rome, why then let Imogen waste no longer any thought on him, but bestow her affection on one who was ready to be her devoted friend and servant. He, Iachimo, would never neglect her as Leonatus had done. Imogen interrupted these silky speeches with indignant scorn, and ordered Iachimo to leave her presence instantly. "What ho, Pisanio!" she cried, to summon her faithful attendant, for she would not listen to another word from this insulting stranger. Then, with supple guile, Iachimo suddenly changed his tactics, and burst into the most glowing praise of Leonatus. He implored Imogen's pardon, and declared that all he had said was quite false, and only to test her love. Leonatus was one of the best and truest of men. He sits among men like a descended god. He hath a kind of honour sets him off, more than mortal seeming. Iachimo's present words made amends to Imogen for his unworthy artifice, and she pardoned him, and resumed all her former gracious charm of manner. "I had almost forgotten to entreat your grace in a small request," said Iachimo, as he was taking his leave, "and yet of moment too, for it concerns your lord, myself, and other noble friends or partners in the business." "Pray, what is it?" asked Imogen. Iachimo answered that Leonatus and about a dozen of his friends in Rome had joined together to buy a present for the emperor. He, as their agent, had purchased this in Florence. It was plate of rare device, and jewels of rich and exquisite form. They were of great value, and being a stranger in Britain, Iachimo was anxious to have them in safe keeping. Might he beg of Imogen to take them under her protection? "Willingly, and I will pledge mine honour for their safety," responded Imogen. "Since my lord hath interest in them, I will keep them under my own protection, in my bedchamber. They are in a trunk, attended by my men," said Iachimo. "I will make bold to send them to you, only for this night. I must leave tomorrow. Therefore, if you please, to greet your lord with writing, do it tonight." "I will write," said Imogen. "Send your trunk to me. It shall be safely kept and faithfully yielded to you. You are very welcome."